My name's Belle Whitwam, and I am part of the Climate Action Network Committee. I've got a particular interest in land use and wildlife, and I'm pleased to say that we're sort of very active in this area. We've got loads of projects going on in Wotton. We've actually planted about 6,000 shrubs and trees in the last 3 years, which we think is pretty good going. We've got lots of wildlife projects going on. And we've also got established a nursery which is growing sort of trees and shrubs of local native provenance that we can then use in our planting schemes in the years to come. So we've got lots going on. We have a wonderful cohort of volunteers. Many of the faces I see here I recognise as having been out on various planting schemes. But if you aren't one of those but you'd like to get involved, then please do make sure that your name is on the list at the back, and you've ticked the bit that says volunteering. Yeah, Karen's waving it. She's got that at the back. So see Karen. Just before I move on to hand on to the speakers, the last thing I wanted to mention was just quickly about Brown's Piece, or Hack Hill. We've got a poster up here about it. It's a local community initiative to keep that piece of land as a bit of land for the community, for people to enjoy and for wildlife. There are plans afoot to try and buy it because it's currently up for sale. If you're interested in getting involved in that, then Moira is here, who will be able to tell you more about it. So do have a chat with Moira if you want to know more about that. And we are particularly looking for a fundraiser because we've got to the point, we've got quite a lot of members. We now need to get some funding in to help us buy the land. So if anybody is an ace at fundraising, then please do get in touch. We've got a real variety of talks tonight, different topics to listen to. We're going to start with Professor Dave Cowell, who is the president of Wotton Heritage Centre. Is that right? Yeah, got that right? Yeah, okay. He's going to talk a bit about sort of water in the historical context, the mills and sort of domestic health and water and things. So we're going to start with that. We're then going to move on, and Simon Hunter, who's the CEO of the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust, is going to talk about Wotton as part of the wider Little Avon catchment, because that's where Wotton's water sits, is within a wider catchment that is part of the Little Avon. We're just after that bit, we're just going to do a quick roundup of what the Climate Action Network have been doing to monitor some of our water quality in Wotton. So that'll just be 10 minutes telling you about what we're currently doing. And we know that what we're doing is part of what a lot of other people are either doing in Wotton or want to get involved with. So, I hope that'll be of interest. But if there are other people out there doing water monitoring of any sort, please do get in touch so we can coordinate our efforts. And then we'll have a quick break, 10-minute break, and then we're going to end up with Claire Howe, who's a senior advisor from Natural England with a specialism in mammals, who's going to talk about beavers and their role in river management. So a bit wider, further afield than Wotton. We haven't got many beavers in Wotton, but I think it'll be an interesting way to finish up. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Dave Cowell.
Thank you very much for inviting me and the Society. We'll start by actually going back to the 1500s and a comment from a local chronicler, John Leyland, who described Wotton as a pratty market town well occupied with clothiers. By the end of my talk, you might not agree with that. And clothiers, well, they weren't the Mr. Thomases of this world, of course. They were the wealthy producers of woolen cloth. And of course, woolen cloth has been important to the prosperity and the wealth of Wotton for centuries. And that is something really to be well aware of. The other aspect I'm going to talk about is health and water. And some of you may be aware of the Edbrook Spring Spout, which is opposite the church on the end of the cottages there. Some people believe that was the original water supply to Wotton. Well, it was used for washing carts and for filling a trough for cattle, but I don't think it was really the actual supply. Right, and I'm not going to talk in depth of the woolen industry and how it worked, because it's really quite complex and would take me a long time. What I want you to see is where... Oh, I've done the wrong thing. Backwards. And what I want you to see is where water was actually used in the process. So it's used in lots of parts of the process, right down to the finishing of the material, the wool itself. What I would mention is scouring, which was the cleaning up of the wool. Now, there were two things involved in that: stale human urine and pig's dung. Now, ladies, I'm sure you will know that ammonia is very necessary when you're dyeing your hair. Well, stale human urine actually produces a lot of ammonia because of the breakdown by bacteria of the urea in it. Now, with regard to the pig's dung, I don't know whether you're aware, but we all have about 1.5 kilograms of bacteria in our gut, and I'm sure the pig's no different, right? So his excrement actually has lots of bacteria that are very good at breaking down organic material. So hence, that's what they were used for. Now, this is a map of where the old mills were in the height of the industry. So if we start up at Coombe Lakes, we've got the dye house. Then we've got scouring houses, which are where the Severn Trent pumping station is now. A long way out of Wotton and well below Coombe, from what I've just told you about the use of pig's dung. I'm not surprised it was there. Then as we move down the stream, down Tiley Stream, we've got Stranger's Mill and Ven's Mill. All that's left of that, of course, is the counting house. That's across the way from the new Lees. Then we come down to the dye house, which is now at Holywell Farm. Then we've got Britannia Mill. Britannia Mill wasn't actually on the stream, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and was important. Poundground Mill was at the bottom of Manor Lane behind the church. So both of these two are where Britannia Mews is now, right at the top end. Then we come down to Moore's Mill, which is at the top of what was Potter's Pond. And the name Potter's Pond comes because the gentleman who had Moore's Mill at one time was John Potter. So that's why it's Potter's Pond. Across the road there was the Cloud Mill. And then we came down to Austin's Dye House. Austin's was a very important name in Wotton in the industry. There are other mills. There's Old Town Mill and Steep Hill, and I'll mention those in a minute. Then we've got Hack Mill, which is further down the stream, and Dudley Mill. Dudley Mill was actually set up by Rowland Hill. I'm sure you're all aware of the Rowland Hill Tabernacle, and it was there to fund his almshouses. Now, the other important thing about this map is it's pretty obvious when you look at this stream. There's probably not enough power in that to drive a water wheel very easily. So we have a number of mill ponds. Mill ponds by Ven's Mill or Stranger's Mill, one by the Dye House, and we have Potter's Pond. Now this is the Steep Mill, which is where the library is now. And actually this, back again, actually this didn't have a water wheel. It was in 1802, Austin's put in the first steam-driven mill. And they were the first people to do that in the west of England. So Wotton was at the front of the Industrial Revolution in Gloucestershire. The other thing to mention about this is it became church mill because it was bought by the church and was used as clubs for young boys and young girls. And later on, it actually became one of Pitman's schools. Now, Old Town Mill, again, this is on Old Town, obviously, and it's where the Catholic Church is. So that was another steam-driven mill. Hack Mill, and here we can see it with its pond, or as it was called, the Lido. This did not produce any wool. It would produce brown paper, which was used in the final stages of the woolen process in the finishing of it. Let's move on to health and sanitation. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Wotton had nothing, right? Nothing at all. There was no drainage, there was no water supply. In 1600s, Richard Venn and Hugh Perry of Perry Doors, almshouses, did build a water conduit from Edbrook Field to the Market Cross. Now, Edbrook Field is what we know as Parklands now, and I'll come back to this conduit in a few minutes. So we had Wells sunk at Tolsey in the 1600s. In the 1700s, there was a pump fitted to that, and to wells at the Star and the Swan. What is important is that endemic diseases, and lots of them may be waterborne, were very common. And in that 36-year period, there were 6 epidemics. Right? We think about COVID, well, nothing compared to these. Scarlet fever, enteric fever, diphtheria, dysentery, cholera, smallpox, all part of things that happened at that time. Now, I mentioned the conduit from at what was called Edbrook Field. This is the tithe map from 1847. This is Old Town here. You go round the corner, there's Adie's Lane. Up Adie's Lane, before you get to Conacher's, you can't read it, but I can tell you that says Conduit Hill. And that's where we think the conduit into the town actually started. Now, the population in Wotton reached its peak about 1830. And in 1832, Austin's went bust. And the woolen industry declined very rapidly after that, and as did the population. So, what about water? Or what about the sanitary conditions in general? Well, in 1854, the local vicar, and the vicars come into this quite a bit, and a local clothier, Samuel Long, got 66 ratepayers to actually sign a petition that they wanted a Board of Health. Now, this Board of Health came about after the 1848 Public Health Act. This is a copy of the last 2 pages of that report. It was a 27-page report. What I wanted you to be aware of was actually this was done from London, from Whitehall. It wasn't a local report. It was done nationally. Now then, what came out of that report? Well, it decided there was still no water supply to Wotton. There were wells, and some of them were private and some of them were shared. Some of them were up to 100 feet deep. Many of them were contaminated, particularly as privies contaminated the well water. There was one covered drain in the whole of the town. So privies were drained into that, and there's even reports in this report of people saying that slaughterhouse waste was seen running down the street. See how nice Wotton was? It was a lovely place. Go back. The conclusions of this report was that the Public Health Act should be applied to Wotton, but it wasn't, because there weren't 66 ratepayers, there were 430. And they voted it would cost too much money and they couldn't possibly do it. So nothing happened. We then move on another 40 years, and another vicar, the Reverend Sewell, actually did get a water supply put into Wotton. And it came from Hamblin Brake. Anybody know where Hamblin Brake is? Not a clue. It's the golf course. Right? And across the road from that, there was an old quarry at what was called Simmons Hall Hill, which they concreted, and the water fed into that. And I'll talk about where all the water came from in a minute. This was not to supply any businesses. It was for home use only, but it was insufficient. And you can see here, 2 years later, by the spring, the water supply was just dropping dramatically. This photograph here, this is a photograph of when the supply was switched on, when it opened up. And you can see it was obviously very popular. This gentleman here with the white hair and the beard is Reverend Sewell. This gentleman here in the top hat is actually Earl Fitzharding from Berkeley. And he was very much against the ratepayers paying again for a water supply. Surprising that, isn't it? This is a cartoon, which you do find sort of reproduced in many sort of books and things, which is within the society. And this is, we don't know who did this cartoon, but it actually shows the cause and effect of the implementation of this water supply. This is the Reverend Sewell. You've got things like ratepayers, very glum. You've got people enjoying swimming. You've got things about fighting fires, everybody enjoying themselves. So overall, I think it was probably well supported. But 2 years later, 1900, Wotton didn't have water again. This is the middle of the summer. This is July 1900. Coombe Valley Brewery was offering the parochial committee free water. But the interesting thing is, A, it was the parochial committee, and B, it's not even signed. It's signed Coombe Valley Brewery. So, very odd. Now, where did the water come from? Well, we don't know who drew this map, but we've got 2 copies of it. And this is Hamblin Break here. There were 16 springs which fed into a holding tank and then fell by gravity across the Tetbury-Wotton Road to the quarry that they built, and it had a chlorination plant on it there as well. And then water was fed by 4-inch pipes down to Wotton and to Sinwell. Now, one thing that is of interest here is the 2 cottages are mentioned. Whether those are the 2 cottages on the right just before you meet the junction of the Dursley-Tetbury Road, I don't know, but that's what we think they probably are. 1909, Tiley Bottom. 2 springs were actually tapped, and water was then fed to 3 holding tanks, and they set up a pumping station to pump water up to the quarry, up the top of Rushmire there. That was a steam-driven pump, and it operated for 9 hours a day until the 30s, when they put an electric pump in, and in the 50s we believe they put 3 electric pumps in. So, how did you get your water supply? Well, it passed, for some reason, we don't know when, from Wotton Parochial Committee to Dursley Rural Authority. I wouldn't have gone down well at all, would it? Going to Dursley. These are the rules and conditions of having it put in. If you wanted the water supply into your house, to put a 1/2-inch pipe in, that's having it, the land dug and the mains tapped, it would cost you 2 shillings and 11 pence per yard. That's about 15 pence per metre by today's money. I think the water boards charge a bit more than that these days. Right, now this is trying to show you where pumps and that were. This is a modern map. The blue is the Cotswold Way, and all these spots for wells and taps were done by an Irving Webb in 1990s, who said that in the 1930s he had drunk from every one of these. Here's the spout, the water spout opposite the church. Then we've got wells at Hollywell. We've got them at Knapp Road. We've got them on Wortley Road. We've got shared wells all the way up Long Street and Bradley Street and Ellencroft. We've also got pump wells at the Tolsey, the Swan and the Star. Now the taps were in Cherry Orchard. They were at the junction of Sinwell and Knapp Road, Sinwell Lane and Knapp Road, and at Old Moors Well there. And the Wotton one was opposite the Walmore where the telephone box is now. That was removed in the 50s. What's interesting, Wotton's got 1 public tap. There were 3 in Sinwell. Does that tell you that people in Wotton had more money, they could have it put into their house? I don't know. So, a few years on, 1949, I did mention that we had an open drain. Well, they found it on the steep, Ludgate Hill. If you look at this, is the best picture looking up, and you can see the slabs here and the drain underneath. Here's the water pipe they were putting in. So that was the covered-in drain, so presumably it came straight down the main street. And then, of course, it went into Dyer's Brook. Right, so we've got waste going into Dyer's Brook, we've got dyes going into Dyer's Brook, and everything else you can think of. So, the other thing that was obvious, that we were going to need additional water supplies. Hamblin Break was actually closed because of contamination in 1953, although golfing colleagues of mine still say they walk round and use the spring water when they're halfway round. What's the other thing here is this photograph here, which shows a water cart delivering water to Wortley. This is 1944. 1944, and there is no water at Wortley. Their spring has dried up. That's coming from Wotton. We then moved to 1960s, And this is the London Road tank being built. And we then went to the 1980s, the one on Coombe Hill was built. But both of these were supplied not from where we've been talking about, they were supplied from the other side of North Nibley at Mill End. Now Mill End, if you go out of North Nibley, you go down the hill, you go up the hill the other side. If you look to the right in the field, you'll see a brick building in the middle of the field, which doesn't make any sense. That's where the water's coming from. In the late 80s, they closed the Coombe pumping station, but then opened it in the 90s. Possibly, I think, Martin informed me just the other day that there are now 5 springs that come from Tolsey, that are from the Tiley, and there's fed up there. So perhaps that's what they were doing at that time. I haven't any information on that. So, to draw things to a close, water recreation is also important. And in 1914, we have a nice view here of the Coombe Lakes of people actually bathing. We also have Hack Mill Lido in 1932 with the swimming club. I wouldn't like to have swum in that, would you? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Anytime you wish, please come to the centre. It's just across the car park. Everything that I've shown you has come from our archives of nearly 13,000 things on Wotton. Right? So please do give us a visit. We would love volunteers. We're desperate, like everybody else, for volunteers. A few hours during the day would be great. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dave. I think that was absolutely fascinating. I mean, we're all take for granted the fact we can turn our taps on, and of course that's really, in fairly recent history. I should say I did try and get somebody from Severn Trent to come along and talk about our current domestic water supplies and wastewater treatment, and I couldn't find anybody who would come. So if anybody has any contacts or anything, I'd really love to know, because they couldn't provide anybody for tonight. So I'm going to hand on to Simon Hunter, who is the CEO of the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust.
Thanks for inviting me this evening. So, as Belle says, I'm the Chief Exec at Bristol Avon Rivers Trust. Before I get started, I just wanted to see how many people in the room know of Bristol Avon Rivers Trust. Oh, wonderful. So there's a few hands there. So I'll give you a bit of a recap who we are in the next slide. But for those of you that aren't, please listen. We are a charity. We are one of 65 local rivers trusts across the country, and our mission is to protect and enhance our rivers for the benefit of people and wildlife. And we've got a wonderful team of people that deliver education, community awareness raising around the health of our rivers, and also the practical and river restoration in-house team as well, which look to restore parts of our river, improve habitat, improve biodiversity, but also deliver good quality blue spaces. And essentially we are the voice for water in our region. You can see from the little diagram in the top right hand side of the screen there, or my right, your left, we operate across quite a large patch. We're called the Bristol Avon Rivers Trust, but we do fall within the Little Avon. So I'm going to talk to you about Little Avon in more detail. And we basically operate right across 5 different local authority boundaries, down into North Somerset. So we look after the Rhines and the ditches and the Congsbury Yeo, as far south as that, right up to the Little Avon in the top, and we go right over to Wiltshire, and we also work with lots of groups and partnerships in the Upper Avon itself. So the big old patch, we're a team of 11 people, and we've been going for around about 12 years now. So why do we do what we're doing? Well, really, when you strip it all back, rivers are, the lifeblood. Without fresh water, we wouldn't all be here, and the species that survive on this planet wouldn't be here. And fresh water is really important for generating the resources that we require to survive. But freshwater ecosystems such as rivers, lakes, ponds, when they become degraded, the services and the benefits that they provide also diminish. And unfortunately, I'm going to show you a few slides in a minute that show the general state of our rivers across the nation. And then I'm going to take it a step back and look at sort of the Bristol Avon, and then we're going to focus on the Little Avon catchment up in Wotton and surrounds. 86% of our rivers across the nation are failing to support good ecology. That assessment is based on Water Framework Directive, which is European legislation that stipulates that by 2027 we will have good ecological status across 100% of our watercourses. We're nowhere near that. That legislation came into play in 2012 and we've stagnated over a decade. We have not seen enough improvement in the quality of our rivers, and that 86% is absolutely staggering to be failing miserably. On top of that, we're looking at freshwater species populations are declining twice as fast as those in the marine environment and our terrestrial environment. A third of all freshwater species are threatened with extinction. A 93% collapse of migratory fish species have been seen across Europe, and we've got the lowest Atlantic salmon stock records at the moment, which is below the sustainable levels within our rivers. Our freshwater ecosystems really need us, and we have to take action now to prevent this decline that we're seeing across Europe, but also the UK in general, and even locally, which we'll get into the detail about a bit later. So looking a little bit closer, this is the Bristol Avon catchment, and I was just mentioning the Water Framework Directive. The little map there, I can't see, the colours aren't great, but you can see there's not a lot of green and a lot of orange and yellow and red. Basically, those colours aren't good, and they show that actually 12% of the Bristol Avon is reaching good ecological status. So hang on, let me see if I can use this. There we are. So we're up here. So this is the Little Avon here, and you've got the Little Avon catchment is actually divided. I'll tell you in a minute. It's divided into 6 watercourses, but we're up in that top catchment. So actually, look, you have got a green bit, which is quite something to celebrate and something to absolutely look after. But as I say, we were supposed to achieve good ecological status by 2027. The goalposts have now been moved. We're looking at 2063. It's a little bit bonkers, isn't it? So at 14% nationally, we are a long way from achieving the target, and we are simply failing to look after one of our most important assets on this planet. So the Little Avon, it's a beautiful little river. It's probably one of my favourite. I say that to all the audiences I perform in front of, but no, I don't. The Little Avon is wonderful. I love the Little Avon. I think it's a brilliant little catchment. It's beautiful. Obviously, the springs are sort of emerge on the edge of the Cotswolds, and the main river flows 15 kilometres through the towns of Charfield. We've got Stone, and then we've got Barclay right at the tidal extent before it then discharges into the Severn Estuary. The local geology, we've got a friable sandstone and clay, and the stream is made up of 2 halves really. We've got the upper catchment, which is beautiful. It's steep. It's made up of what we call pool and riffles. So we've got these beautiful deep pockets of water where you get lots of trout and other species that sort of find refuge, and then you've got these lovely glides and riffles. We've got that fast flowing water over gravels. We see lots of what we call water crowfoot and weeds within the watercourse, which again are a sign of good health. There's a huge variation of habitat within this little catchment. As we move slowly downstream, we get to Stone, and just below Stone we see the river sort of span out. It's very flat around there. We've got this big sort of Severn Vale space where actually it's been heavily modified. A lot of the land there has been drained for agriculture. We've got drains and ditches and networks of marine systems, so quite an artificial landscape, but nonetheless the watercourse as it goes through there is quite beautiful. There have been impacts, and we will look at some of those a little bit later, but it's a wonderful, tiny little catchment with so many different habitat types within it. So in terms of the Water Framework Directive, what does that look like for the Little Avon catchment? And, well, I can show you. So in terms of the Water Framework Directive, the Environment Agency undertake the surveys every cycle, and each cycle is 4 years. So this data is based on a 4-year cycle. The last cycle was in 2022, which is what this table is based on, and we'll read some of these out because the words are quite small, but you can see, unfortunately, out of the 6 watercourses across the Little Avon catchment, only 1 is supporting good ecological status. That is the Oswald Brook. So those of you that know, if I go back to the last slide, it's this watercourse here. It runs up into the escarpment here, so running down. So you've got Wotton here, and actually some of the streams that run down the brooks, all of that is encompassed in that good classification. Although, having said that, there is a risk to the Oswald Brook in terms of hydrological regime. So what do I mean by that? Well, climate change is sort of clenching its fist. We're seeing more extreme temperatures, and we're seeing water become extracted as well within that subcatchment. There is a danger that water levels will reach sort of critical lows during summer periods, and we're already starting to see in invertebrate populations that there are times of stress throughout the year. So our concern is that not enough water in the summer could actually deplete the quality of that river during those months. Other reasons for failure. Let's look at some of these other watercourses. You've got the Dorvert Brook, which again, if I go back to here, I can point out is this watercourse. I've got a better map coming up a bit later, but it's this one here. So it flows into the Little Avon a bit lower down. We've got the Upper Avon here, which is the watercourse that is failing for Water Framework Directive. So we're looking at the headwaters here from Hawkesbury down into Wickwar, right into Charfield. Now that watercourse is this one here. Now all of them are failing for phosphate. So phosphate is a nutrient that is derived within the landscape, but also artificially through both point source and diffuse pollution. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've got the water industry discharging waste into our watercourses, and we've also got quite an intense landscape in terms of agricultural works as well. And we are seeing impacts from agriculture, runoff from fields, during storms. All of those nutrients that are applied to those fields end up in our watercourses during storm events. So there are impacts that we are seeing, and that is one of the reasons that these watercourses are failing Water Framework Directive. We also have some legacy pollution. So we've got what we call PDPEs, and we've also got mercury and compounds found within our watercourses. That is not unusual across the nation. It is one of the failures here as well within this space. And I think, really, when you take a step back and you look how beautiful the Little Avon catchment is, and then you sort of dive deep into the results, it's really quite shocking to see that we've got no blue on this map. It really is quite a worrying story when this is one of the best we've got. So what are we doing about that? Well, we've been doing a bit of work over a number of years with various partners in the room, some of the angling clubs, looking at sort of ad hoc projects to improve habitat, look at how we can improve sort of fish habitat in particular. But over the last couple of years, we've been trying to sort of raise funds to be able to deliver some more strategic work, look at the catchment as a whole. How can we look at this whole area and understand, okay, we know what Water Framework Directive is telling us, but how do we actually pinpoint what the issues are, and how can we resolve those as part of a strategy and a plan? So between October 21 and August 23, we carried out a series of walkover surveys. Our specialist team, our ecologists, we've got a whole bunch of different team farm advisors have been out in the catchment, and we've identified what we call lots of opportunities and lots of challenges within the catchment. We've mapped those. We've got georeferences. We understand where some of these point source pollutions are. We understand where some of the diffuse pollution is coming from. We also understand where there are barriers to fish passage as well. So if we're looking at trying to sort of create a more resilient catchment, how can we allow some of our species to move more frequently within our watercourses, to spawn, to find new habitat, to get away from poor water quality? So again, all of these things have been mapped, and we've created this wonderful report over the past year. And we've started to engage both some of the large and the small landowners within the catchment. And we've actually worked on several what we call whole farm plans. So we've worked with landowners to create these options for their land, so helping them to try and find the funding to deliver the work on the ground. So some of that might be looking at excluding livestock from watercourses, simple things like fencing livestock away, preventing them from poaching the banks and defecating in our watercourses. Also working with people that have got arable land which perhaps don't have any buffer strips. So again, thinking about how we keep sediment on the field instead of it sort of rushing off into our water networks with nutrients attached. So there's been really some quite quick wins where we've developed those plans, and I'll come on to some of those a bit later. This is one of the outputs from our report. So our report basically creates it's a big table full of these opportunities, and what we've tried to do is provide a photograph with a description of some of the issues that we found, the challenges, alongside a recommendation. So how can we fix that bit of river? What could we do to improve the ecological value of that stretch of river? And we tend to think, in 100 to 400 metre lengths. So again, for every bit of the river, we've got a plan. Some of it is great, some of it doesn't need to be touched, some of it could be a great reference reach to try and replicate elsewhere. We've seen some shocking things along the way. I'm not going to sort of beat around the bush. I think some of the land management has been quite terrible in places. We've seen really compact soils. We've seen pigs sort of grazing within the watercourses. Again, you know, we've seen soil literally moving in the winter months into the watercourse. And we've seen lots of sort of deforestation in areas as well, in other sort of land management issues. We've also seen a lot of ditch networks that have been sort of cleaned every year, every bit of habitat within it removed, vegetation removed, lack of sort of a riparian buffer. So it's not an uncommon sight in this catchment. We also undertook some riverfly investigations. We've got a wonderful network of volunteers across the Bristol Avon. I think we've got around 75 volunteers that regularly assess riverfly. And what do I mean by that? Well, they take a kick sample at a fixed location each month. So they're in the river, they're kicking the riverbed. They've got a net, they capture all the invertebrates in the net. And invertebrates are wonderful beasts. They basically are sensitive to pollution. So when you set up a riverfly site, you look at what species you've got, you create what you call a trigger level. So that's the abundance of species that you're supposed to get at that particular site. If that level drops and suddenly you've gone from 8 species to just 2, you know that there's likely to be a stressor. So something is impacting the watercourse at that point in time. And it's a really good indicator for finding out and, again, working with the Environment Agency. So when we start to see some of these triggers hit, we report it. The Environment Agency should come out and investigate some of that, some of the incidents further. Now, what we've done here is we've actually gone a level above, and we've undertaken a program of work called Smart Rivers. And this is essentially, again, it's a kick sample, but it gets analysed to species level, and then it gets sent to a lab, and the data is actually ran through a couple of models, so sort of data models. And what it can actually do is tell you or indicate towards the actual cause for that particular pollution. So it can look at the stressors and basically from the species present and some of this analysis, it can tell you what is potentially impacting that particular site. So it's a really, really good sort of level of analysis, and it gives us a good indication at these locations what some of the stresses might be within the watercourse. So in general, I've got a bit of a summary here. We collected data across an autumn period and a spring period to give us 2 bits of data. Now, in an ideal world, if you had funding, it continued to sort of flow, and you do this continuously. So we've collected a baseline. We're now trying to find funding to try and continue that work. But what we found is that actually the health of the river, all 5 sites, was generally pretty good, apart from site 2, which is up here on the Dorvet Brook. We'll see a little bit later in terms of the data, but this site was quite problematic. And we did find actually there's stresses down at site 3 as well. So we're going to have a look at the data now. Try to keep this quite simple, but hopefully you can all see this. I'll explain it. There's the map again, and these are our sites going down the left-hand side. So 1 to 5 here. Anyway, looking at this generally, you can see that in the ideal world, you would have blue all over this map, unimpacted, beautiful rivers, and no stresses to wildlife. But actually that's not the case, and we have got some sites that are performing really well. So again, this site 5 down here, again, most of it is only slightly impacted. So when I mean slightly impacted, what I mean by that is that there is going to be a small implication to wildlife at that site based on the stresses. When we look at moderately impacted, again, it's likely that fishing and wildlife is likely to be impacted by the stresses at that particular site. And impacted, we are definitely seeing an impact to wildlife. Luckily, we haven't seen any that are heavily impacted. But what are the reasons for this? Well, if we look at number 2, which is this site up here, so the Dorvet Brook, we've actually got 2 readings, again, one spring 22, one in autumn 22, which is poor, and that is under pesticides. So we're seeing pesticides at that site implicating the invertebrate levels that we've got in the river. Now, obviously, invertebrates are the base ecology. If invertebrates are being impacted, then we know that it's likely that the rest of the ecosystem is being impacted too. At that site, we also saw that actually it did have a slight impact to organic, which again is linked to potentially sewage within the watercourse. It's not alarming, but it does mean that there is an impact at that site too. So that could come from, again, some of the potential land management issues that we spoke about. We did spot lots of slurry sort of, not covered up and sort of leaching into the watercourse in various locations. We also found that at site 3, which is this one down here, so again in the headwaters of the Little Avon, this links really well to the Water Framework Directive. Again, that upper part of the catchment is actually poor status, so it's the worst performer out of the 6 water bodies. At that site, we actually found that it has an impact related to siltation. So again, when we're looking at sort of land management, we're looking at, there's livestock within the watercourse there. We've got arable again with minimal buffer strips. We're seeing that sort of input on the ground, and then we're seeing it within our data as well. Again, you'd want to sort of collect this data over a longer period so you can make proper statistical analysis from it. But at the moment, it gives us a bit of an indication as to where we should spend time and investment in making some of that watercourse better. And obviously, any benefits that you deliver up here, you're going to see downstream as the water that flows through the river is going to be more clean. And essentially, these reaches through here will become better as well. So again, that's a bit of a snapshot from Smart Rivers and some of the data collection that we've been doing. So what does it suggest? Well, it suggests that in a number of locations, land management practices are having a detrimental impact to the base ecology. So based on the facts that I've just pointed out. We've also found that there are a number of barriers to fish movement within the catchment, unlike, very similar to most of the Bristol Avon, in fact, and most of the country. There are a significant amount of barriers. What I mean by that are weirs, sluice gates that prevent the migration of a lot of our fish, a lot of our aquatic wildlife. And these barriers also change the environment. So you've gone from this, beautiful, fast-flowing river where you've got lovely pool riffles, as I mentioned, the upper Oslerworth Brook, to suddenly becoming a lake or a pond, and suddenly the species there, they can't cope, so they move, and you suddenly have this new ecosystem that sort of crops up. So actually, where we've got these barriers, in my honest view, it would be wonderful to think about a strategy of how we can either remove them or improve fish passage, so that we can get some of these migratory fish coming from the River Severn spawning again back in the Little Avon. We've got Atlantic salmon, we've got critically endangered European eel, we've got sea trout, we've got these wonderful species that are going to become extinct unless we think about unlocking our rivers and making them more habitable. So it's a real problem, and the Little Avon, to be fair, has a minimal amount, so there's not a huge amount of work to do in comparison to the rest of the Bristol Avon and other catchments, and there's been some great work delivered to date in terms of removal of those weirs, but how do we take steps now to be able to unlock more of our rivers to enable that new habitat to be opened up? Alongside that, thinking about water quality and actually improving the habitat is really crucial as well. So there's no point in opening up a river that has poor, supporting habitat. So alongside barrier removal, we've looked at options within our report to improve and restore rivers. So look at putting things like woody debris back into river, diversify the flow conditions so that we've got these myriad of little mosaic habitats that support a biodiverse riverscape. And water quantity, that is a major issue, I think, going forward. In a lot of our catchments, we've seen rivers at real sort of dwindling levels during summer months. Now that is going to be a more common theme as we move forward. Climate change is, here, it's happening, and we are seeing more wet, extreme weather in the winter and more dry, really extensive periods of drought. And these are the norm now. So we have to work differently to ensure that there's enough water in our rivers to sustain the populations of aquatic life, as well as, supply that water for us. So there's a fine balance, and there's lots of work that could be done, I think, differently within some of our catchments to ensure that that isn't as impactful as it's being at the moment. So there's also a risk that as urban expansion occurs, that will be greater stresses to our rivers. More impermeable surfaces and additional drainage, including urban runoff, will discharge into our rivers, essentially more quickly and with the contaminants linked to them. So we've got surface water drains, across Wotton, across all of our little villages. They all end up within our rivers. There isn't a filter strip that stops that contaminant from getting into our rivers. The more development we have, the quicker the water's going to get there, and with more contaminants. So it's a real sort of issue that needs to be resolved. It can be resolved. with design. Development now needs to go through what we call biodiversity net gain. So it's become a mandate later this year. Developers will have to ensure that there's a 10% uplift in biodiversity, but at the moment, rivers are not really considered. Water quality, not really considered in that assessment. So we're doing as much as we can as a local trust to raise that and asking for additional, support from our planning authorities. But at the moment, there is no legislation to say that a site doesn't create more surface water, and therefore it doesn't have to restore our rivers the way that really it should, because these sites are going to have that impact. There's going to be additional hard surfaces, which means more surface water entering the combined sewage network. So again, I think we all know about the combined sewage network based on what the media's been telling us recently, but we do have a Victorian system. It is outdated. Surface water basically fills that system up, and then we see what we call our combined sewage outfalls basically spilling more frequently. Now, there is risk that with more development, if it's not carefully designed, we're going to see more CSOs spilling raw sewage into our water networks. And our water recycling centres will need to process more waste. There's more people living in areas. Do they have capacity to take that waste? And do we know what their plans are to expand their treatment works? I mean, it's not a question that many people ask, but should be, because I'm not aware of what the local water companies are doing to improve or enhance the capacity of some of the existing sites. That to me is one of the key questions to ask right now of our water industry. And also as well, going back to the water industry, there's also treated sewage that's being spilt back into our rivers that is also of high nutrient level. So again, at times of drought, we're seeing dilution rates being a lot less than it used to be. So again, all additional stresses. So I'm going to have to run through this last bit. So we have delivered lots of measures to date. We've worked with some brilliant partners. South Gloucestershire Council have funded some of our work. We've worked with a number of estates, Berkeley Tortworth Estate to name a couple. And we've worked in partnership with Berkeley Estate Fly Fishing Syndicate and also Charfield Angling Association on a number of river habitat improvement projects. We've also delivered several sort of scrapes within our headwaters, again looking to slow the flow, looking to improve biodiversity with some of the big estates as well. So we're hoping that some of this sort of pioneering work will become the norm, and we can deliver this more sort of widespread throughout the Little Avon catchment. So how do we improve the health of the Little Avon? Well, it's a big question, but I've kind of outlined my thoughts really. It's got to be a partnership approach. We've got to work together to be able to develop a plan and then to think about the blue sky options that exist within our catchment to make it more resilient. We can use our report and our findings as a starting point, and we can use other data sets. Let's bring it all together. Let's see what we've got and work together to be able to create this plan. There's lots of things that can be done through volunteer groups. So part of our remit is to try and bring everyone together and work together to be able to sort of collect that data and build that picture and deliver efforts on the ground. Explore opportunities for fish passage. We've just released the Bristol Avon Fish Recovery Strategy. It's a document that is live. There is a link on this. So if you get a link to the slides, click on that button and you can have a read of that yourself. Really important that we start thinking about better connectivity of our rivers with the estuary. And work with stakeholders to enhance and restore the habitats along the Severn Estuary. We've got a wonderful intertidal habitat there. We should be thinking of trying to make that more resilient. You know, we've got tidal rise, we've got more flooding. How can we take some of those drainage ditches and turn them into sort of wetlands, you know, to deliver biodiversity as well? I'm having to whiz through, sorry everyone. And want to take action, why not volunteer? I've got two of my team in the audience here, so I've got James and Mike. Just quickly put your hands up. We're running a load of volunteer work at the moment. There's water quality sampling, there's river fly monitoring, all the things that I've whistled through in this talk. We're undertaking, we're scaling up. So please, if you're interested, have a chat with those guys there. They'll be able to give you some more details around what we offer. There's a whole plethora of things that I've got on this screen that you can ask them about. And then what I will do is just say thank you very much for listening. I won't take any more of your time, and hopefully, Belle, that's just on time. Thank you.
Are you happy to take a few?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Thanks very much, Simon. I mean, that painted a really good picture of how Wotton fits in the bigger picture. I mean, you know, it's really important we understand the impacts, how what we do in Wotton might impact further downstream and you know, and right the way through the catchment. So thank you very much for that. Simon's happy to take a couple of questions. So We've got one at the back from Martin.
Yeah, I mean, it's a careful balance. I mean, I think your question was around weirs and the first bit of your question. And weirs are, they're big structures. They've been put in place. They're not moving. They've obviously got a flood risk, or some of them have a flood risk implication as well. So you need a thorough investigation of that particular structure. So we're undertaking quite a few examinations of different weirs across the catchment. Some of them will need hydrological modelling, so actually to physically produce a model to look at how the flow conditions will change. It can be really expensive, and it's quite capital heavy as well. So in terms of removing weirs, it's quite an arduous process.
I was thinking more of natural weirs.
Natural. Okay. So in terms of fallen debris, yeah, sure. It's a good question. I think in terms of habitat value, wood in rivers is wonderful. That provides the diversity of flow. But again, is it an area of flood risk? It's a grey area. Now, in terms of headwaters, looking at sort of the streams, and if you've got like an upland river, allowing branches and debris to fall within to allow that water to spread is brilliant, and it provides great habitat. Lower down, where you've got some of your more managed and artificial drains and ditches, then again, they need to be cleared to convey water. So there's a real balance, but what we're trying to do is reintroduce the natural processes that would have once existed, but you can't necessarily do that easy within a really heavily managed landscape. That's why the way that these watercourses are managed must change at the top, and there must be a strategy built around that.
I think it's also quite important, if you're starting to put sort of leaky, woody debris dams in, is to have a strategic approach in the catchment, isn't it? Because what you do in one bit of the catchment can actually impact on another bit of the catchment, and you need to have a bit of a plan about how they all interact, really, don't you?
Yeah, you do, and thinking of fish as well. We've got salmonids that need to sort of migrate into these beautiful tributaries. Leaky dams in the right place. It's like the right tree in the right place. I think it's important that the analysis is done, and we're not just doing it ad hoc. To build on your answer.
And really important that you keep them silt free as well, so that they've still got passage underneath to get back up again. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question, and part of our remit, or my remit in particular, is to build those relationships and to sort of paint this picture. Now, council budgets are obviously spread thin. We've done a really good job in terms of securing money from South Gloss this year to deliver these wonderful projects. The latest one delivered a couple of weeks ago near sort of Tortworth Estate. So there is a realisation that water is really important, and they have these climate emergency pots of money and funding. We're trying to sort of pull it towards delivering for restoration, for improving biodiversity as well. So we're slowly painting that picture, and I think they're coming around to it. There are bigger pots of money out there to be secured. Again, it's bringing people together, working collaboratively, and creating that strategy to prove that money spent is well invested. That's the key. The question, great question. Water Framework Directive, I've mentioned, was put back to 63. Is that European-wide, or is it just UK? Well, actually, the answer to that is it is UK, because we're going to move away from the Water Framework Directive. So it's a shift of the goalposts for our country, unfortunately. And the fear is we haven't seen the devil in the detail, but it looks like, unfortunately, forgive the pun, it is a dilution in terms of the legislation, and we're not going to see the drastic change that is needed quick enough. A very good question. Absolutely, and it depends on the time of year as well and the flows. I mean, some of that was taken during sort of autumn, so the source of the problem is always going to be stronger. So we saw, for example, the siltation pressures up in the headwaters, and by the time it got down, that silt would have dropped out. It may have, sort of breached the banks, deposited in the floodplain. It could have, basically got better. So yes, usually you'd expect it to be the other way. So it was quite interesting to see that. But I think because of some of these areas that are really poor, we've had those sort of drastic results in those locations, and it seems to be a lot better. The river is in a much better condition lower down in the catchment in terms of land management. Yeah, we're looking at ways that we can fund time in the right places, and I think building on this sort of baseline is critical. 1 year's worth of data is only so good. So we'd love to be able to go out there and have a proper prod around and find out what the root cause is, and then, if you can solve it in the headwaters, you're going to benefit the rest of that catchment going down.
Because you mentioned about streams drying up in the summer, but I mean, one of the things I think we've all noticed around Wotton is a lot more water, during heavy rainfall events, and how silt-ridden it is. I mean, is that also the sort of converse issue, or do you think it's more of a problem that they're drying up in the summer?
I think it's an equal problem. I think climate change is changing, the extremes, and certainly flooding is an issue. And I think with silt, that's coming from a source, that's coming from problematic farms, perhaps it's coming from the upper catchment. So how can we create a strategy that allows our catchment to be more resilient in both extremes? So how can we have more water in the summer but less in the winter? Perhaps looking at ways we can store water on land for longer is the solution. Nature-based solutions, natural flood management, all of those measures could be a really good way of storing and slowing the flow, taking the peak off the hydrograph essentially, and reducing the sediment loads to our rivers as well. So absolutely, both are extreme and both are a problem.
Thanks very much, Simon. That was a really fascinating talk. So would everybody like to just give him another round of applause, please?